I'm somebody who, within the Congress party, would be considered perhaps right of center.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhary. Thanks for watching Inquiry. We're ending the year with a big double bill on the idea of India and the battle for belonging from two perspectives, the BJP and the Congress. This interview is with Shashi Tharoor, a veteran Congress leader, a writer and a polymath, who's just written a book called The Battle for Belonging. I speak to him here about his idea of India, the party's idea of India, whether there's need for introspection and course correction, and why they're not able to deliver electorally on their ideas. Thank you very much for joining me, Shashi.
Good to be with you, Shoma, as always.
So, Shashi, you've written a book, Battle of Belonging, and we're in the middle of that battle. In the simplest possible terms, can you define the core of your book for an audience that hasn't read it?
Well, it's actually a study of nationalism and patriotism. First, worldwide linguistic nationalism, territorial nationalism, religious nationalism, etc., etc. And then I basically break it down to two kinds of nationalism. One is a nationalism that is linked to identity, whether it's your religion, whether it's your language, whether it's your race, your skin color, whatever it may be, which you can broadly summarize as ethno-religious nationalism. That's broadly one kind of nationalism. And the second kind of nationalism is civic nationalism, which is not a nationalism based on identity, but a nationalism of institutions and constitutions. So America is the archetypal example of civic nationalism, because you can migrate to America tomorrow. It doesn't matter that you're not white. It doesn't matter you're not Christian. It doesn't matter you didn't grow up there or study there, weren't born there. But once they make you a citizen, you have every single one of the rights, and the equality of those rights and equal access to opportunities guaranteed through liberal constitutionalism, enshrined in democratic practice, institutions that are autonomous of the state, and so on and so forth. So you would be, in this sense, paying allegiance not to a kind of blood and soil nationalism, but to civic nationalism, the US Constitution. That's the sort of two classic archetypes. So the remaining three quarters of the book is about India. I go from there to the Indian freedom struggle, which was classic anti-colonial nationalism. And then, through the making of the Constitution of India, converted itself very deliberately and after much debate into a civic nationalism. Yeah. And then we come to the Battle of Belonging itself, which is the triumph of the ballot boxes in 2014 of a very clearly different idea of Indian nationhood. And that is the idea of the Hindutva movement that says, forget it, this country was always, first of all, a Hindu country. Everybody else of every other faith is either a guest or an interloper. They shouldn't presume to have any greater privileges. In fact, we, the Hindus, should have the principal rights on this country, and the rest live here on our sufferance and on our say-so. And this notion, which has been summarized as Hindu Rashtra, is often captured in the famous RSS slogan, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. Now, my argument is that the battle is between those who have this vision of Indian nationhood and those who still cling to the civic nationalist vision. And that battle is a very important battle because it defines who we are as a people.
You should have written it in four, it would have got read, much more. But Shashi, so I'm going to cut through all of the knowledge you would have packed into that book to really come to the contemporary fights. And as you said, the Battle of Belonging is these two ideas of India, the one that's enshrined in the Constitution, or people now call it the Nehruvian idea of India, and the Hindutva idea of India. And it's too clear, it's been discussed a lot, so I'm not going to trace those battles. We're living it out right now. Mm-hmm. The question I want to ask, Shashi, is that how do you even see the battle for your idea of India, what you call the constitutional idea of India, being played out? Everything needs politics, it needs a political vehicle. And the Congress party has so utterly failed the idea of being a political vehicle in our democracy right now, that there's no one to speak for it. So the question I'm asking you is, there's no point going on saying that there's this battle, How are you going to enliven this battle and make it seem valid and interesting to people?
Well, I think you're absolutely correct, Shoma, that it's a political task and that the principal challenge for us in the opposition, the Congress and other parties who do not share this view, is to resist the ruling party's immense control over the media, over other independent institutions, its relentless use of social media, because there is this narrative that has been created in recent years in which the BJP's, in my view, intolerant message is overpowering and is shaping a hegemonic, narrow-minded idea of India, in which, of course, they demonize any dissent as anti-national, which is another reason why the nationalism theme was so important to this analysis. Because it's by defining nationalism the way they do that they presume to call others anti-national. Now, it seems to me that, first of all, we have to persuade people at two different levels. Now, one is the level on which I've written this book, which is the level of argument. I've talked about patriotism, for example, and I've often quoted a line, I've forgotten who originated a century ago, that said that patriotism is defending your country all the time and your government only when it deserves it. So one should be able to explain to people you can be a proud Indian, you're a total patriot, and still oppose the BJP, the ruling party, and the government, because the BJP and the government are not India. Your love is for India. These are the people who temporarily happen to be ruling it. And that nothing is more patriotic than speaking out against injustice, regardless of who is meting it out, even if it's those in power today. So that, to my mind, is one level. The second level is the nakedly political, which is to say to people, all this 56-inch chest thumping and rhetoric about Pakistan and Bharat Mata Ki Jai doesn't fill your stomach. If you voted for the BJP 5 years ago thinking that you'll have a job by the end of it, why are you voting for them again when you still don't have a job or you've lost the job you had? Which is the reality for the vast majority of Indians. This is a government that, for all its rhetorical talk, all its narrative shaping, has been a disaster at economic performance. And it is time that we manage to get voters to vote in their economic self-interest, because that is ultimately what most voters do. The whole American expression of voting your pocketbook. Well, in India, amazingly enough, though already in the 2019 elections, we were facing an electorate at a time when unemployment was at a 45-year low, at a time when every single sector of the economy was down, before COVID. Yeah. Even then, one bomb blast in Pulwama, one retaliatory strike in Balakot, a lot of inflammatory speeches, and North India went lock, stock, and barrel behind the ruling party. So somehow we have to tell people, bhai, any party would defend the country's self-respect. But who has actually catered to your basic needs? Who came up with the Munrega scheme and fed the poor in the villages? Who gave you cash support for your crops? Who ensured that the factories were humming and there were jobs available? Who did all of that? It was actually us, not them. They have actually destroyed everything that we'd given you in the preceding 10 years. For God's sake, bring us back and we will change this country. Because there is no doubt that the sheer incompetence of governance that we've seen on display ever since demonetization, the first of many follies and examples of ineptitude, that people have suffered. So that would be the second level about it.
Shashi, you'll have to allow me to butt in, because as you know,
sure.
I did want, an intellectual combatants on the show, but your schedules weren't matching, and I wanted two other authors who've written a book on India.
I've read it. In fact, I've given them a blurb, as you may have seen.
Yes.
I actually said that I think that what they've done is welcome contribution to this sort of debate. Huh? I mean, I'm actually, I'm somebody who, within the Congress party, would be considered perhaps right of center, both in terms of economics and in terms of my overall policy. I mean, many people know that in the university days, I was about the sole supporter of the Swatantra Party anywhere around. And the truth is that as far as I was concerned, there was a lot to be said for a much more liberal view of India than prevailing orthodoxy actually permitted. But having said that, there was strongly an argument for them to make. Unfortunately, what they made was an argument that itself, in my view, I have real disagreements with.
Okay. So, but, because our audience won't know what we're talking about, I have to first spell out. So one thing first, Shashi, and I'm going to ask you that. There are two levels at which our conversation will run now, is the politics on ground and the ways in which the Congress are failing it. And the other is the battle at the level of ideas, and where I want to play devil's advocate and put out the views that the more Hindutva intellectuals are putting out and pose those to you, So first, I know you don't want to talk too much about the Congress, but tell me, Shashi, how do you see the ideas that you're fighting for be enlivened if there's no political vehicle in this country? So just in 3-4 points without going into the details of what's going on within your high command and your low command and your dissenters. Why don't you just...
unfortunate phrase. Listen, I mean, look, I would argue that it's not fair to say there is no alternative. The Congress is the alternative. It is still a national party with a footprint throughout the country, with a vision, with a history, and with amazing talent on its bench. I mean, that's something that even our most savage critics will admit, is that, the entire BJP with 6 times the number of MPs as us put together will not be able to produce a fraction of the kind of competence that the Congress party commands daily that would be able to respond to the nation's problems. Having said that, for me, the issues of core values which exemplify the idea of civic nationalism, secularism, for lack of a better word, I'm equally happy with pluralism, inclusivity, which is very important, and social justice. Now, if you can bring these things together, which the Congress party does, and I would argue the BJP does not, as a matter of policy does not, then I would argue that we have the clear battle lines drawn. In fact, take religion and religious freedom, for example. We've always identified a clear distinction between Hinduism, a religion, and Hindutva, a political doctrine. The fact is that Hinduism, which we respect, is inclusive and non-judgmental. Hindutva is a political doctrine rooted in the idea of exclusion. It's a narrow-minded interpretation. And whereas religion is the personal concern of every individual, the fact is that this political doctrine that calls itself Hindutva has no resemblance to the principal tenets of my Hindu faith, as I've described in 2 books. And the reason is quite simply that the Congress party today is not at all afraid of avowing its personal Hinduism, but it's waged a constant defense of what unites us as Indians. The immense diversity of language and culture for us is a unifying force, not a dividing force. But unfortunately for them, it's, we actually had a BJP MP standing up in the last session of Parliament saying Hindi should be the national language. And then, of course, the Tamil MPs rose up in protest, and so did many others of us. So
you have
we don't want to divide the country. Yeah.
You have a BJP minister in Karnataka saying that we will not give a single ticket to a Muslim. So it's a very it's a very visible sort of battle line for them. But wait, I'm going to kind of keep holding you down, Shashi, because you're hard to contain. So so I'm just going to come back to what I was saying about the political vehicle. I said I won't take you into the intricacies of Congress politics because you requested me not to on this interview. But I'm going to ask you one blunt question, which is, no matter how much competence on your bench, if you all as politicians are not willing to hit the road and eat the dust and meet the people and do good old-fashioned sweat and toil-based politics, how is this opposition ever going to flourish? Aditya Thackeray, Jagan Reddy and Tejaswi Yadav have shown us that good old politics still has impact. But the Congress is only sitting around. Do you think that's a valid criticism?
No, it certainly wasn't true of the whole country, and it wasn't true in the pre-COVID era. I mean, I would agree that COVID cramped our style in many ways, that many of the initiatives taken tended not to be so much replicable on the ground. But first of all, I mean, if I can be at the risk of sounding immodest, I can say without being on the ground, I wouldn't have won 3 elections in a row myself in the face of the Modi wave and in the face of a major resurgence of the BJP in my constituency and in my state. So the fact is that as far as I was concerned, I'm not disagreeing with the argument that grassroots is where the party's strength has to be built and tested. And I have reason to believe that's not always been true in every part of northern India, granted. But the truth is that we can't generalize. It's a big country. And in places like Kerala and Punjab, where the Congress improved its performance, to some degree Tamil Nadu, perhaps on the coattails of the DMK, certainly a bit in Maharashtra, solidly in Madhya Pradesh and Haryana, you've seen a fairly big turnaround. This did not happen without the Congress being out there in the grassroots as well. So to imply that the Congress is only about sitting and tweeting, as many of our critics say, is, I think, a travesty, because it's not borne out either by the objective reality everywhere in the country, nor is it borne out by state results in many places. So that's the first answer. Sorry, go ahead.
So if you're saying that there is endeavor, one doesn't see it at a national level, one doesn't see it as
But you are all very northern centric. You're looking at bad performance in Bihar and generalizing for the whole country. I'm sure that Bihar there's a lot of lessons to be learned from it. But honestly, it's totally irrelevant to how we'll do in Kerala in 6 months' time when we have a state assembly election.
But one is not seeing endeavor in Uttar Pradesh, one is not seeing endeavor in Bengal, one is not seeing endeavor in Bihar, one saw you lose Madhya Pradesh, one saw you, so there's a lot, Shashi, and there seems to be just this stonewalling of...
Can I pick that apart right away? Uttar Pradesh, who led the Hathras agitation, who dominated the nation's agenda on that issue for 2 weeks? It was the Congress, including on the ground, including Rahul Gandhi, going to the family of the Hathras victim. Madhya Pradesh, you say that we lost the government. How do we lose the government? Not on the grassroots. We won in the grassroots. We won the election. The BJP bought away corruptible MPs. It's a shameful answer to give. But the truth is that you did win an election from the voters, and it was essentially taken away from you by means, I suppose, formally speaking, legal, but ethically, morally, in every other term, completely dubious and unconnected to the principles of democracy. So I think, once you start going into each of those examples...
We'll get sidetracked from our core intention.
Exactly.
But, using the moderator's privilege to kind of just have a last word on that, I was just thinking when this whole farmer protest was happening that Rahul Gandhi took up that issue, in Madhya Pradesh. And then these 6 years, if you all had really stayed with it in a sustained way, you would have had a voice. Right now, it's their agitation. You all are really external to that movement. But let me come back to the battle of ideas, Shashi. You mentioned these two other authors, Harsh and Rajiv Mantri.
Yes.
And Rajiv Mantri, who've written a book on the idea of India.
Right.
The core criticism they have of the nationalism and the idea of India that you are describing is that it actually lays too much stress on religious identity. They're saying that let's look at India as a civilizationally a Hindu India, but actually which just stretches over many centuries. And in a modern India, the individual liberty matters, that all individuals should have equal rights under the Constitution, and we should not look so much at the identity of communities. And in fact, they're doing a counter-criticism of the Congress and Nehru, saying that it enshrined everybody into their communities. The Muslims were always treated with a kind of noblesse oblige, not allowed to move out of their community identity, not just have individual rights, but be ghettoized as a Muslim community. And that's their counter-criticism. You've often come under that criticism that secularism has become an apologetic secularism and its own kind of communalism. What would you say to that?
So I've actually said this we had an exchange. Since I mentioned I gave them a blurb, I had said in that blurb that there's much I disagree with in both their premises and their conclusions. It's a pleasure to engage with their ideas, because I certainly make common ground with some of those, and there are very, very few right-wing intellectuals in India, I might add, but some of them have no difference with me on free speech issues, economic freedom issues, government reform issues, individual liberty, where Rajiv Mantri and I don't know Harsh so well, but they certainly, he and I see eye to eye on all this. But on the question of communal identity, I would argue that if anything, it was the Congress party that by and large made religion irrelevant. In other words, you were not supposed to raise an eyebrow to see a Muslim in a prominent position, because the assumption was supposed to be it didn't matter what he was. That was the whole logic, right? Why did Mrs. Gandhi have Sikh bodyguards, who in the end, unfortunately, ended up killing her? But her argument was, I will not judge an individual by his religious faith. That's the Congress principle. And so the only ones who are communalizing discourse are not us, it's the BJP, which by raising the Hindu Rashtra bogey and by overwhelmingly arguing that only one community has a primary claim on the very identity of India, let alone its resources, its nationhood, its slogans, its ethos, very, very frankly, that obliges us to respond in kind. I have, for example, pointed out, how can you accuse India of Muslim appeasement at a time when the Muslims are the poorest, the most economically vulnerable, most disadvantaged community in India, underrepresented in the police, underrepresented in the bureaucracy, underrepresented in the judiciary, and overrepresented in the prisons? Now, is that an example of successful appeasement? So my counter argument to these people is that for the Congress to say that those who are weak and vulnerable need to be helped, you have obliged us to define them by religion. As far as the Congress was concerned, we used to define people more by class. And there was what is a Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme? If you are poor enough that you need some amount of paid employment, otherwise you're forced to leave your village and look for work in a city that may or may not have work to offer you, we will give you work in the village. Now, that doesn't ask you what religion you are or even what gender you are. In Kerala, for example, 92% of the beneficiaries are women. And of course, there are women of all religions and castes. So let me stress that this communalizing argument is a very clever way of turning their weakest point into their excuse for their own bigotry.
So Shashi, unfortunately, because they're not here, I'm going to be...
I don't mean Mantri and Gupta, I mean the BJP ecosystem as a whole. That argument is a BJP argument.
Yeah. So, but the BJP, so much of this battle is being fought out at the level of cultural wars rather than economic wars. And if there was a BJP interlocutor here, they would remind you that even Mr. Modi's government claims that their economic welfare state that they are rolling out is also, fairly equal. And it's not like they're ghettoizing Muslims and not giving Muslims, say, the rations or the LPG or the shelter. So they're saying that their economic program is for everyone as well. The battle is really at the level of culture. And that's where, of course, if I bring up the issue of love jihad or the fact that there's a backlash on a Muslim and a Hindu kissing in front of a temple in suitable boy, I mean, unfortunately, there'll be no argument between you and me because I'm as aghast as you on that. But the question which I would like you to examine is that the BJP and the Hindutva brigade say that this idea of nationalism that you stand for, or Nehruvian idea of India stands for, is also deracinated, that it is not situated in its culture at all. In a way, it became a kind of knee-jerk rejection of everything that was Hindu. And that there's a great need. There was almost an apology. If you wear a janayu, if you wear a bindi, if you wear a tika, if you do the Hanuman Chalisa, anything which is an overt cultural gesture, you're seen as communal. And that is also their argument. Do you think that if you were to take that on, is there a new position which is more positive than your old position and their criticism? Is there a new position that you can articulate?
No, I think the old position was caricatured. It wasn't like that at all. First of all, we were very rooted in culture, but particularly in places like North India and Kerala, where there's a significant minority of other religions, it was a composite culture. Nehruji was proud of, the BJP leaders, when they dress up for a formal national occasion, they're wearing a sherwani, which didn't exist in India until the Muslims brought it here, right? Or a variant of the sherwani. Even the Modi jacket comes from a garment that didn't exist in ancient Hindu India. We are a composite culture. I've got a section in the Battle of Belonging about the whole notion of Indic civilization. And I point out that we are an evolved hybrid. We've had influences from these people who came and settled in this country and brought a lot of their cultural influences here. And similarly, we've been influenced by the British. The collared shirts that many people wear, or the pants many people wear, are actually British. The shoes many people wear were brought here by the Westerners. So we have evolved as a hybrid. Indic civilization isn't frozen in the culture, the clothes, the music, the food habits of the Vedic past. It's not. It simply isn't. And so for them to say that the culture we avow is somehow less authentic than theirs is laughable, because the culture we avow is the genuine culture of heterogeneous India, in which all these influences have come in and are inescapable. Now, when we look at bigotry and intolerance, you mentioned the FIRs in UP and MP about the kissing scene and love jihad. Is a preposterous notion that love should be reduced to a jihad is itself a sad travesty of the mentality of these people. But I would argue that what is far, far worse is their actual denigration of the great strength that Indian culture has acquired by being able to absorb all these influences and speak confidently of it all. We're very self-confident about our culture. An Indian who is equally comfortable enjoying a classical raga and appreciating a Western film or reading an English language book, that Indian is actually far more at home in the world than an Indian who takes pride in being close to every influence but that which has come directly from his Sanskritic ancestors. To my mind, this is a reduction of Indian culture. We've seen it very recently with the Culture Ministry appointing a committee to look into the ancient origins of Indian culture. And it's 14 people, all of whom are male, all of whom are Hindu, all of whom are from northern India. I mean, how do you expect such a narrow-minded mentality to even begin to grasp the majesty of Indian culture and its extraordinarily rich and diverse strands? Pluralism is the strength of India. And I have to warn these people, their narrow-mindedness and bigotry will only divide India, not actually create the illusory, monolithic or unified India or uniform India that they actually imagine in their darkest fantasies. First of all, that doesn't exist. And if they attempt to create it, they will drive away people who do not share their assumptions.
If for a moment I stop being your adversary, I would actually, re-emphasize what you're saying, that it's amazing that in a country like India, which, as you said, is just so plural, and which, on sexuality, on just the basic issue of sexuality and love, I mean, we were way more modern than Europe and America. And, it's ridiculous that we should be brought down to objecting to a kiss in front of a temple or jihad, even at the level of conversion. I understand if it is some big money coming in and pumping a mass conversion program, but two people in love, an adult opting to, move into another religion, all of that is too ridiculous for two people who agree to argue about. But Shashi, the question I would ask you here is much more perplexing, which is also a question that America is facing. And as I told you, I asked Fareed Zakaria that we can sit here and criticize that till kingdom come. It's of no use. The question that you as an intellectual need to take on is that, why is almost half the population buying into this? When there's an argument as ugly as ridiculing biryani now, biryani has become an offensive symbol in a country that is an absolute celebration of plural food. And 47.3% in America voted Trump. India...
Only 37 voted BJP, let's not forget.
Okay,
so
but
it's not yet nearly half, as you put it.
37% is still a very large number. I want to ask you an uncomfortable question, Shashi, and not give pat answers. Why are people buying into their articulation of India, And not everybody sees themselves as ugly and bigoted and intolerant. There are people there who see themselves as very good people. What is attractive about what they're saying? What is the gap that they are filling? Those are much harder questions for you to answer as an intellectual.
Well, I mean, paradoxically, economic failure has been strengthening the BJP's political success, as I mentioned to you earlier. But one of the reasons for that also is that when there is less of a pie to go around, there is greater unwillingness to share it with people, especially if you're able to define them as being not like you. So those people who wear a beard or who hide themselves in a burqa or whatever, those people don't really belong. Why they're laying claim on my diminishing pie or my diminishing rice bowl, whatever it may be. So that actually, paradoxically, the BJP's own economic failure has partly enabled its agenda because people have become more selfish and more exclusionary. The second thing is undoubtedly the fact that Pakistan's attacks and the facilitation of terrorism in India have created a certain backlash amongst many in India, and particularly Hindus also. I think some non-Hindus feel equally strongly that we need to stiffen our resolve against them. That doesn't necessarily include bigotry. I'm a hawk on Pakistan without being a Hindutva bigot. But the truth is that it has helped the government, and it helped them, as I mentioned, at the time of the last elections, because it's very easy to wrap yourself in the flag and have people support you for that. I don't know how much of that 37% actually voted for the BJP specifically because of these issues. Certainly in 2014, the principal thrust of the campaign was economic, the Gujarat model, the Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, all of that. And I would say of the 31%, my guesswork is that the BJP's core Hindutva vote remained below 20, and the rest was all people attracted by Mr. Modi, the development guru. By 2019, a lot of that sheen had faded, particularly with the disastrous demonetization and the completely botched implementation of the GST rollout done with such haste and such poor preparation. So then it had to be, the appeal had to switch much more to nationalism, national security, and bigotry against Pakistan and against Muslims. Now, the political opportunism as to which bits of your ideology will emphasize. You had mentioned earlier that they've got a welfare state going. The things that they are doing to produce welfare are actually all the very things that Mr. Modi derided, not only in the 2014 campaign, but in Parliament. He pointed to the Congress party and said the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme is a monument to your failure. It's to your shame because you are making people dig ditches. I will give them productive work. And it's because of his failure to give them productive work that he's back to boasting about the fact that he's giving people money to dig ditches. So let's be very clear. There is absolutely no credit to be given to the government for their welfare schemes because they ran on an anti-welfare program. In Gujarat, there's hardly any welfare. In fact, on the Human Development Index, Gujarat is very low down the totem pole, even under Mr. Modi, because the fact is that everything from maternal mortality to child malnutrition is amongst the worst in India. Because the government had no welfare schemes. What they boasted of was successive economic growth figures because of their making life easier for business people and giving land for special economic zones, exports, ports, all of these things. Now, that model is what they were essentially selling for the rest of India. It's their failure to do what they came to do that has led them to become welfareists. So for you to today cite their welfarism, to me, I must say, doesn't wash, Shoma, because they have had to, in defeat, in moral defeat, have had to take a leaf out of our copy.
No, I see that. But as I'm still saying that they clearly have a kind of political hold and an emotional hold and a cultural hold on people's psyche. And I was asking you as an intellectual, that is there any ground you want to cede on? You know, one knows what's negative. I mean, the hate stuff is so, again, like I said, for me, I find it very hard to understand how hate and bigotry can be so attractive. But when you're saying that the economic vacuum, you know, the fact that unemployment is at a 45-year high is helping them use culture and nationalism as a hold over people, the pushback I would do there, Shashi, is I would understand that if only poor people were the BJP constituency. But actually the upper class, the educated and Indian middle class, the elite are very, very aligned with the BJP. And where is their attraction then? You know, what is the attraction of the upper middle class to the BJP? And intellectually, how do you understand that? How will you bring them back to your way of thinking?
Well, I think by persuasion. I mean, there's, to my mind, I think opportunities for the Congress party are very clear and very open. First is the complete economic failure of the government, which definitely needs to be pointed out. The second is the government's complete inability to speak openly with the people, everything from the Prime Minister to not having press conferences, to the dissimulation we've seen on everything from the China border to the economic management of the country, even the resignation of the chief statisticians because of the government's attempt to fudge the facts and the numbers when it comes to economic growth. So you've got a government that no intelligent, educated, intellectual person of any ideology should be happy to work with, both because the failure is transcendent and the dissimulation and hypocrisy and, I hate to say this, but even lying that we've seen from the highest echelons really ought to make any sensible person say, I want no part of this. So that has to be very much part of our appeal. There are fears and misgivings there. There is a fear and misgiving, for example, that the Congress, even rhetorically, will not be committed to the ease of doing business that the government talks about. To which my counter is we will be committed to the ease of living for the people of India, including the business community. And if you can be allowed to do your work in peace, my point is liberalization was a great Congress achievement in '91. Let us stick to the spirit of that. Let's liberalize more sectors. Let the business community have a free hand, but let us ensure that the revenues we get from that growth are distributed to the weak, the marginalized, the minorities, the poor, everyone essentially who has been left out so far and needs a leg up to participate in the marketplace. And I will tell the business community, this is in your interest. The people we're giving a leg up to today through our welfare measures will be your customers and consumers tomorrow. So don't oppose us for our so-called povertarianism. If we can actually end their poverty, we'll actually be doing you also a favor in the long term. So all of these messages, as far as I'm concerned, we ought to be giving to the business community, to the right-wing intellectuals you talked about, or the people in the educated upper middle classes who are showing some sympathy to the BJP. Where I will not give them aid and comfort is on this communal argument. No, India is not just a Hindu country. No, it's not just a Hindi-speaking country. No, it is not just Aryavrat or Hindustan or whatever. It is this wonderful plural land where, as far as I'm concerned, a Tamil Christian and a Kerala Mapla Muslim have as many rights as you sitting in the UP heartland or the Hindi-speaking heartland of the country. And the day you don't recognize that, I will continue to oppose you. The day you accept that and give all these people the same place of honor, they will contribute so much more to the greatness and success of your India, of our India.
So Shashi, let me take you through the key, like the lightning rod issues which attract everyone and get everyone het up, One, so I'm just going to list them so we can quickly run through them. One is Kashmir, Uniform Civil Code, Ayodhya, these, and history, this whole idea of the Mughal past and the Muslim rule and the fact that one has suppressed all the violence that happened then. These are the issues which urban Indians and well-off Indians really vibe with, and they feel that, yes, there's great wrong being done to India and by the Congress party and by the Nehruvians, and we need to fix all this. So let's just run through that. Now, we'll come to Kashmir, but let's do Uniform Civil Code, because inevitably, I think this government has it on its cards and it's going to come up. So if you are creative about it, Shashi, do you think that you need to articulate a new creative position on the Uniform Civil Code? Because people will remind you when you were saying, we've never looked at the communities, we've always said it's rights for everyone. They'll bring up the fact that the Hindu temples, the trusts are run by the government, but the Muslims are allowed to have rights over the Waqf board. They'll remind you about, of course, Shah Bano. They'll remind you about your opposition to triple talaq. They'll remind you that Muslims want that even whether they do it in practice or not, in principle, they can have 4 wives. Why not Hindus? Basically, that Hindu personal law was legislated, and it is right. It should be legislated because no society changes itself. Why is the Congress so afraid? 70 years later, I understand straight after partition, Nehru had to heal a lot of wounds, reassure people. But 70 years later, people will ask, why can't Muslim law be legislated into some semblance of modernity? What would your answer be there?
I think it's first of all, the examples you gave, I personally have not been on exactly the same page as my party's established position, largely because I wasn't in my party when I took my position. So, for example, I have been a strong critic of the Shah Banu action on the part of the Congress government at the time, and I've done so in writing. Similarly, I have written, including in books since I became an MP, about the inequity of only one religion's places of worship coming under governmental legislation and fiat. And I agree with those examples. And frankly, by lumping me with all established Congress positions, my critics do me a disservice because my track record is a bit more complex than that. And I joined the Congress party only in 2008. So I really have a very long paper trail before that. However, where I do not part company with the Congress party on the Uniform Civil Code is on the argument that however desirable it is, and I would stress, I believe a Uniform Civil Code is desirable in our country, that it would be folly to impose it without bringing communities along with you for fear of the social unrest it'll cause and the other complications. You see, the great thing that people don't often perhaps remember is that Uniform Civil Code only applies to a handful of issues: marriage, inheritance, divorce. I mean, there are just very, very few things which personal law is even allowed to govern. If a Muslim murders a Hindu, he can't cite personal law. But if a Muslim marries a Muslim, they can do so under their personal law. These are the kinds of differences we're talking about. Now, from my point of view, if the Muslim community today gives, shall we say, itself more of an opportunity to evolve its own attitudes and customs, this will happen more easily and more naturally than if a Hindu majority government imposes its decision by its overwhelming legislative majority upon an unwilling minority, because the unwilling minority will resist, and you will have any attempts to then impose the code could create all sorts of terrible backlash. Unfortunately, even within the Hindu community, first of all, it was a huge battle for 9 years after independence to pass the Hindu Code Bill. Ministers resigned over it. The government had major splits within it. Ambedkar resigned because he felt Nehru wasn't going fast enough on it. So you have all of these history behind you just on a Hindu Code Bill, where there was much greater sort of majority sentiment in the party in favor. But when you're looking at something where the communities that you are trying to quote unquote reform are strongly resistant, then you have a real danger. After all, we know there are social practices being conducted outside the pale of the Hindu Code Act as it now is. Take, for example, the Khap Panchayats. They have no legal standing. They're making decisions all the time in many states in northern India that are actually legislating punishments to couples, to families. Okay, so your son slept with so-and-so's wife. As a result, her husband can sleep with your daughter. Where is that coming from? It's not part of Indian law. It's not part of the Hindu Code Act. And yet we know such things are happening. We read about them in the newspapers. So just like that, do you want a uniform civil code that the Muslim community will ignore and thereby casting disrespect upon your legislative framework? Isn't it better to bring them along with you so that they are actually part of the process? And as I say, if you restrict the applications, first of all, under the Special Marriage Act, every Muslim woman or every woman marrying a Muslim husband has the right to choose not to marry under Muslim personal law, but to seek marriage under the Special Marriages Act. Now, if she chooses not to and she chooses instead to convert to Islam and marry her husband, why should the government of India have a say in the matter? Why should Parliament legislate on such matter? I mean, similarly with triple talaq, which you mentioned, my opposition when I spoke in Parliament was actually not in defense of triple talaq, which I consider had already been outlawed by a Supreme Court judgment. It was no longer legal to practice triple talaq. My question is, why do you criminalize an act of abandonment without compensation, which is what is being criminalized, when you don't criminalize abandonment without compensation by any other husband of any other faith? We all know very famous examples of Hindu husbands deserting their wives without giving any compensation. They're not criminalized. Why would you criminalize only a Muslim man who does so? So my argument is, take the crime, not the religion of the person committing the crime, and punish the crime. Say that anyone who abandons his wife or divorces his wife or whatever has to fulfill certain obligations, otherwise such and such. But here what you said is Muslim husbands, by using triple talaq, will be eligible for 3 years in jail, but a Hindu husband who simply upstick and pushes off to Rishikesh or Hardwar and says, I'm not going to be taking responsibility for my wife, is free to do so without any consequences and is even hailed as a great renunciator. So these are questions that we have to ask ourselves fairly as human beings. And that's precisely my position. It's a human position, not a party position.
So let's quickly come to the issue of, Ayodhya and the fact that it mattered to, the Hindu ethos, because it's a central story for this civilization versus a mosque. Of course, the criminal act of breaking the mosque, unsupportable. But when it comes to the symbolic, and all societies are built around stories. So people feel that the muqabla, if I use that word, was not an equal one, and that it was the Muslim community who a long time ago should have conceded that. And of course, the crime of breaking the mosque completely complicated the matter. But if we just look at it in terms of stories versus history, stories that matter to a civilization versus history, where would you place that? Because these are the emotive issues on which...
Well, we've all accepted the outcome, Shoma. I mean, I think that was exactly as you summarized it. Many of us felt that the act of vandalism was unforgivable. Most Hindus would have wanted to see a temple in Ayodhya because that's their belief that is exactly where Ram was born. Whether it's provable or not, to my mind, is beside the point. It's a question of faith. And faith is usually beyond, historical tests of proof. Also, we know archaeologically that there was an indication of some sort of temple structure predating the mosque, and we don't know what temple it was and whom it was to, but there was something underneath. The Archaeological Survey of India has established that. So for all of those reasons, the debate on Ram Janmabhoomi has moved on. The problem is first that the punishment of the Vandals has not taken place. Indeed, they've essentially all been let off the hook. And second, that there has been a sense that the institutions of the Indian state have awarded Ayodhya, the disputed site, to one community, instead of the Muslim community having been persuaded through artful political management to themselves make such an offer. I think that had we shown a greater political / diplomatic talent and actually got a cross-section of Muslim and Hindu leaders together and worked out a formula where it would be the Muslim community that, in the interests of social harmony, made the offer, rather than it coming out of the court route, that would have been possibly morally a better result. But the result that has come in the end, it's difficult to deny, is actually probably the best thing for all concerned, because of the feeling that we can move on into the 21st century without being bedeviled by a problem by going back to the 16th.
So, Shashi, I'm going to quickly run you through the history in Kashmir, because like I told you, those are the two other big emotive questions. But we have to have space to come back to one last one. So what do you think about 370? You know, again, like there's a lot of buy-in to that. And I'm harking back to this Fareed Zakaria interview, because it was surprising, because even he said that if he really just looked at Article 370, maybe the time had come to abolish it. But he said, if you abolish it, then I would also like to see abolishing of the special oppression that goes on in Kashmir. You know, and I would like to see a sort of dialogue with the people of Kashmir, none of which has happened, but it's just the abolishing of 370. But he did say that maybe the time had come to abolish 370.
Well, look, Nehruji had said that 370 was a temporary provision, that he didn't intend it to last permanently. And I think none of us is wedded to it per se. What we critiqued, and if you listen to my speech in Parliament at the time, was about the manner in which it was done. As I said, you know, our constitution has provisions. There are ways in which you're supposed to proceed, to consult the people, indeed to have the dialogue with the people that you just mentioned. And you cannot declare president's rule on a state, ask the governor whom you have appointed to speak for the state, then conduct a decision in a national parliament in which you have a majority, rather than a legislative assembly of the actual people who are going to be affected, and announce a decision. To my mind, that was the big flaw. And it was not just, by the way, a legal constitutional flaw, because the BJP side quickly dismissed me as making legalistic arguments. It was certainly also very strongly legalistic, but the fact is it also shows an alarming political act of stage management, because theoretically you can do the same to any state in the union. You can actually declare president's rule in any state, get your appointed governor to say anything on behalf of that state, whatever it may be, and abolish some rule or change some special provision. It's a very dangerous way of conducting a democracy. And therefore, for a government that to this day makes a big virtue out of its resistance to the emergency and so on, I felt the way in which they'd gone about it was fraught with dangers. And I also said, of course, that the problem in Kashmir is compounded by the fact of the terrorism and the militancy, because if you narrow or constrict or even abolish the democratic space, you're opening up space to undemocratic forces, the terrorists. And on both of those points, I stand by my critique a year later. It's still precisely what's wrong with that. It's not 370 I'm defending. It's the conduct of the government I'm challenging.
I guess the pushback on that, if there was anyone here to push back strongly enough on you, would be that in realpolitik, you push through certain things because there's no way that discussion would have led there. I come back to the question that it is some of what's going on in the country is extremely, extremely disturbing. You know, the UAPA cases, the oppression of journalists, you know, all this sort of bigotry and the intolerance, fake news. There's just a lot, you know, this legislation of our personal spaces is very, very problematic. But what is the pushback on that, Shashi? Because just articulating it is not enough. What do you think at the heart of the matter is wrong with the Congress right now?
Look, I mean, I'll tell you why, apart from the fact that I really have to go, that I don't want to invest.
Don't run away without answering that.
I am answering it by saying that I've taken a stand not to go into this subject just now, because it only serves the BJP's agenda of distracting political commentators from the government's own failures. See, the party president has stated that she will take the views of many of us who have criticized the internal workings of the party into account, and I'm looking forward to that. But our only objective is to ensure that once again we offer a strong and effective national alternative to the BJP's divisive misgovernance. If we're not strong or effective, we're playing into their hands. That's the argument. But by actually spending a lot of time breastbeating about the Congress party, we are essentially turning the spotlight away from the iniquities, the misgovernance, the ineptitude, and the failures of the BJP government. I'll have to leave it there, Shoma. I've got to go.
Thank you so much, Shashi. But let me also say this, that in a democracy without a viable alternative, you naturally become a monolithic country, you know, and so a lot of this still lies on Congress' shoulders. And I hope that your voice, which one must admit is always very, very independent, puts some blood back into your party. So thank you very much for talking.
Thank you, Shoma. I'll do my best. Thanks so much. Jai Hind. Thank you.